The stagecoach lurched to a stop in front of the general store, and Zelda Johnson stepped down into the dust of Sierra Vista, Colorado territory, clutching her carpetbag like a lifeline against the uncertain future that stretched before her. It was May of 1875, and the spring sun beat down mercilessly on the small town, nestled in the shadow of the Rocky Mountains. Zelda's traveling dress was covered in a fine layer of dust, and her throat felt parched from 3 days of rattling across rough terrain. She was 22 years old, had never been west of St. Louis, and was absolutely terrified that someone would discover she had no business whatsoever calling herself a teacher. The advertisement had seemed like Providence when she'd found it tucked between the pages of a discarded newspaper at the boarding house where she'd been working as a maid. Teacher wanted for frontier town. Room and board provided. Inquire at Sierra Vista, Colorado territory. She'd written immediately, crafting a careful letter that stretched the truth about her qualifications until it was thin as gossamer. Yes, she could read and write exceptionally well. Yes, she loved learning, but an actual trained teacher. That was a fiction born of desperation, and a burning need to escape the life that had been suffocating her in the cramped, grimy streets of St. Louis. A stout woman in a calico dress emerged from the general store, wiping her hands on her apron. "You must be Miss Johnson." "I'm Martha Crawford on the town council. We're mighty glad you've arrived. The children have been without proper schooling for near on 6 months since our last teacher married and moved to Denver." Zelda forced a smile and tried to project confidence she didn't feel. "I'm delighted to be here, Mrs. Crawford. Come along then. I'll show you to the schoolhouse. It's small, but we've fixed it up nice. Living quarters are in the back, nothing fancy but clean and comfortable." Martha took Zelda's carpetbag with surprising strength and started down the dusty Main Street. "We've got about 15 children who'll be attending, ages ranging from 6 to 14. Most can read a little, but their ciphering needs work." The schoolhouse was a simple wooden structure at the edge of town, painted white, but already showing the weathering effects of mountain winters and summer storms. Inside, rough-hewn benches served as desks, and a slate board hung on the front wall. The living quarters were indeed small, just a narrow room with a bed, a stove, a table, and 2 chairs, but after sharing cramped quarters with 5 other girls in the St. Louis boarding house, it seemed like a palace of privacy. "School starts Monday morning at 8 o'clock sharp," Martha said, setting down the carpetbag. "That gives you 2 days to settle in and prepare your lessons. If you need anything, my husband runs the general store. We'll send over supplies this afternoon, flour and such. The town provides your food as part of your wages." After Martha left, Zelda sat on the edge of the bed and felt panic rising in her chest like floodwater. What had she done? These people trusted her with their children's education, and she was a fraud. She could read well because her mother, God rest her soul, had been educated back east and had taught Zelda before fever took her when Zelda was 12. After that, there had been no money for school, only work in factories and boarding houses. She knew literature and poetry, could write a beautiful hand, but mathematics beyond basic arithmetic. History, geography. She was woefully unprepared. That first evening, she inventoried the books left by the previous teacher, a meager collection of primers and a few worn textbooks. She stayed up late into the night by lamplight, frantically reading through them, trying to absorb enough to stay ahead of her students. Monday morning arrived with the swiftness of an executioner's blade. The children filed in, eyeing her with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. She introduced herself with a voice that only trembled slightly, and began with what she knew best, rating. She chose a passage from a collection of folk tales and read it aloud, letting her natural love of stories infuse her voice with warmth and animation. The children leaned forward, captivated, and for the first time since arriving in Sierra Vista, Zelda felt a small spark of hope that maybe, just maybe, she could do this. The reading went well. The penmanship lesson was adequate. Then came arithmetic. A boy of about 12 raised his hand. "Miss Johnson, can you help me with long division?" Zelda's mind went blank. She'd learned it once years ago, but the specifics had faded into the fog of memory. She stalled, moving to look at his slate, buying time. "Let's see what you've tried so far." She fumbled through an explanation that she could tell from the boy's confused expression made little sense. Heat crept up her neck. A few of the older children exchanged glances. By the time she dismissed them at 3 o'clock, Zelda felt like she'd been trampled by a team of horses. That evening, she sat at her small table with her head in her hands, fighting back tears of frustration. She'd barely survived one day. How could she possibly continue this charade? But what choice did she have? There was nothing for her back in St. Louis except poverty and endless drudgery. At least here she had dignity, respect, a place of her own. A knock at the door startled her from her misery. She opened it to find Martha Crawford standing there with a basket covered with a checkered cloth. "Brought you some supper," Martha said. "Thought you might be too tired to cook after your first day." She stepped inside without waiting for an invitation and set the basket on the table. "How did it go?" Zelda considered lying, painting a rosy picture, but the weight of her deception was already crushing her. "It was challenging," she admitted carefully. Martha studied her with shrewd eyes. "The children said you read beautifully, brought the stories to life like nothing they'd heard before, but they also said you seemed uncertain about the arithmetic." Zelda's heart sank. Already in one day her incompetence was showing. "I'll do better tomorrow. I was just tired from the journey." Martha pulled food from the basket, setting out fresh bread, butter, and a jar of stew. "You know, teaching isn't just about knowing everything. It's about helping children want to learn." The last teacher, Miss Pritchard, she knew her figures well enough, but she made learning so dull the children would rather watch paint dry. "You've got something special, the way you talk about books and stories. Don't lose sight of that." After Martha left, Zelda ate the still warm stew and thought about those words. Something special. She'd never thought of herself as having anything special, just a love of reading inherited from her mother, and an imagination that had been her only escape from harsh reality. The next few days followed a similar pattern. Zelda's reading and writing lessons were engaging and successful. Her arithmetic lessons were disasters barely disguised as education. By Friday, she was exhausted from the mental gymnastics of trying to teach subjects she barely understood while maintaining the fiction of competence. Saturday morning, she decided to explore the town properly. Sierra Vista was small, perhaps 200 people, serving the ranches and small mining operations scattered throughout the surrounding mountains. Besides the general store and the schoolhouse, there was a saloon, a smithy, a small church, a doctor's office that also served as a barber shop, and perhaps 24 houses scattered along the main street and the few roads branching off it. She walked to the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to grassland that rolled toward the mountains. The peaks were still capped with snow, magnificent and imposing. She'd never seen anything so beautiful. In St. Louis, the buildings had blocked out the sky, made everything feel closed in and gray. Here, the sky seemed to go on forever, a brilliant blue that hurt to look at. "You're the new school teacher." Zelda jumped at the deep voice behind her. She turned to find a man standing a respectful distance away, and her breath caught in her throat. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with shoulders so broad they blocked out the sun. Long, dark hair fell past his collar, and several days' worth of beard shadowed a strong jaw. He wore buckskin pants and a plain cotton shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing forearms corded with muscle. Everything about him spoke of raw strength and capability, from the confident way he stood to the piercing intelligence in his gray eyes. "Yes," she managed. "Zelda Johnson." "Tobias Brennan." He didn't offer his hand, just nodded. "I live up in the mountains, trap mostly. Come into town for supplies every few weeks." "A mountain man," she said, the words coming out with more wonder than she'd intended. Something that might have been amusement flickered across his weathered face. "Some call it that. I prefer to think of it as living free." He glanced past her toward the schoolhouse. "Heard you're doing well with the children. Where did you hear that?" She was surprised that a man who lived in the mountains would concern himself with town gossip. "Martha Crawford is my aunt. She talks." He shifted the large pack on his back. "Also heard you're struggling with the mathematics." Zelda felt her face flush. "I'll improve. I just need time to prepare better lessons." Tobias studied her with an intensity that made her want to squirm. "Didn't mean it as criticism. Martha says you've got a gift for bringing books to life for those children. That's worth more than numbers, in my view." "The town didn't hire me to just read stories," Zelda said, frustration bleeding into her voice. "They need someone who can teach all subjects properly." "And you can't." The direct question, asked in that level tone, shattered what remained of her composure. To her horror, tears started spilling down her cheeks. "I'm a fraud," she whispered. "I'm not really a trained teacher. I lied to get this position because I was desperate, and now I'm failing these children who deserve better." She expected judgment, disgust, perhaps anger on behalf of the town. Instead, Tobias simply said, "Come with me." He led her back toward town, not to the main street but to a small house set slightly apart from the others. Inside was surprisingly neat, with books lining shelves along one wall. He gestured for her to sit at a rough-hewn table and poured water from a pitcher into 2 tin cups. "I'm not formally educated either," he said, settling into the chair across from her with a slight wince, as if his large frame wasn't quite suited to indoor furniture. "But my mother taught me to read before she died, and I've kept learning on my own ever since. Taught myself mathematics from a book I traded for years ago. Geography from maps and almanacs. History from whatever I could get my hands on." Zelda stared at him. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because not being formally trained doesn't make you a fraud. It just means you have to work harder to learn, and that you might need some help." He stood and pulled several books from his shelf, setting them in front of her. "These are my mathematics books. Borrow them, study them. If you get stuck, come find me. I'm in town every Saturday for the next month or so, selling furs and pelts." She looked at the books, then at him. "Why would you help me?" Tobias was quiet for a moment. "Because when I was younger, after my parents died, I was angry and lost. A man in Montana took the time to teach me how to trap, how to survive in the mountains, how to be something more than my anger. He didn't have to help me, but he did, and it changed everything. Maybe I'm paying that forward." Zelda felt something unfold in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the stuffy little house. "Thank you," she said, and meant it with her whole heart. Over the following weeks, a pattern developed. Zelda threw herself into studying the mathematics books Tobias had loaned her, staying up late working through problems by lamplight until she understood the concepts well enough to teach them. Her lessons improved, slowly but noticeably. The children stopped exchanging confused glances during arithmetic, and a few even began to show genuine interest in numbers. Every Saturday, Tobias appeared in town. Sometimes he would stop by the schoolhouse to check on her progress. answering questions about particularly difficult concepts with a patience that surprised her. He never made her feel stupid for not knowing something, just explained it in different ways until it clicked. But it wasn't just the academic help that drew her to him. There was something about Tobias that called to a part of herself she hadn't known existed. When he talked about the mountains, his eyes lit up with a passion that reminded her of how she felt about stories and books. He told her about tracking animals through new snow, about the silence of the high peaks where you could hear your own heartbeat, about sleeping under stars so thick they looked like spilled salt. "You should come see it sometime," he said one Saturday in late June as they sat on the steps of the schoolhouse. The children had been dismissed hours ago, and most of the town was settling in for the evening. "The mountains, I mean. There's a meadow about 2 hours' ride from here that's full of wildflowers this time of year. Most beautiful thing you'll ever see." "I don't know how to ride a horse," Zelda admitted. Tobias looked genuinely shocked. "How'd you get out here from St. Louis, stagecoach?" "Well, that's something we'll have to remedy. Can't live in Colorado territory and not know how to ride." He stood, brushing dust from his buckskin pants. "Tomorrow's Sunday. I'll borrow a gentle mare from the livery and teach you." Zelda knew she should say no. It wasn't proper for an unmarried woman to spend time alone with a man, especially away from town. But proper had never gotten her anywhere except trapped and miserable. "All right," she said. The next morning, Tobias arrived with 2 horses, one a large roan gelding that suited his size, the other a smaller dappled mare with kind eyes. He spent an hour teaching Zelda the basics: how to mount, how to hold the reins, how to signal the horse with her body. She fell off twice, landing in the dirt with jarring thuds that knocked the breath from her lungs. But each time Tobias was there immediately, strong hands steadying her, checking that she wasn't hurt. "You've got courage," he said after the second fall. "Most folks would quit after landing on their backside like that." "I've survived worse than a little dust," Zelda said, climbing back on the mare with determination. By afternoon, she could walk and trot with reasonable confidence. Tobias led them out of town on an easy trail that wound through stands of pine and aspen. The air smelled like sap and sunshine, and birds called from the branches above. Zelda felt something in her chest loosening, a tightness she'd carried for so long she'd stopped noticing it was there. They reached the meadow Tobias had described, and Zelda gasped. It was a riot of color: purple lupines and yellow columbines and red paintbrush flowers covering the ground like a living quilt. Mountains rose on all sides, their peaks touching the clouds. "It's like something from a fairy tale," she whispered. Tobias dismounted and helped her down, his hands spanning her waist easily, the warmth of his touch seeping through the fabric of her dress. "It's real, though. More real than anything man made." They sat in the meadow, and Zelda found herself talking more freely than she ever had with anyone. She told him about her childhood, about her mother's death, about the grinding poverty that followed, about reading by stolen candlelight, the only escape from the gray misery of her circumstances, about the desperate hope that had driven her to lie her way into this teaching position. "You didn't lie about the important things," Tobias said. "You love learning, you love sharing that with others. The rest, the formal training, that's just details. You're learning it now." "But I started from a place of deception." "How can that be right?" He was quiet, pulling up a strand of grass and twirling it between his fingers. "When I was 16, I was on a ship working my passage to America after my parents died in England. The ship's cook took ill and I lied and said I could cook. I couldn't, not really. But I watched the man, asked questions when he was lucid enough to answer, and I figured it out. By the time we reached New York, I was making decent meals. Was that wrong? That's different. That was survival. So is what you did. Tobias turned to look at her, and the intensity in his gray eyes made her heart beat faster. Sometimes the only way to become something better is to claim it before you're ready, then work like hell to grow into it. That's not fraud. That's bravery. Zelda felt tears prick her eyes again, but these were different from the frustrated tears of defeat. These were tears of relief, of being seen and understood. "Thank you," she said, "for everything. The books, the help, believing I could do this." "You're doing it yourself," Tobias said. "I'm just watching." As the weeks turned into months, Zelda found herself looking forward to Saturdays with an anticipation that had little to do with academic questions and everything to do with seeing Tobias. He'd become a fixture in her life, a constant she relied on not just for help with teaching but for companionship, for laughter, for conversations that challenged her mind and stirred her heart. She was falling in love with him. She realized one warm July evening as she watched him demonstrate a mathematics problem for one of the older boys who'd stayed after school for extra help. The way he patiently explained the concept, breaking it down until it made sense, the gentle encouragement he offered when the boy finally understood, it all spoke to a kindness that lived beneath his rough mountain man exterior. But did he feel the same? He was always proper, never overstepping bounds, treating her with respect that bordered on reverence. Sometimes she caught him looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read, something soft and warm and wondering, but he never said anything, never made any indication his feelings ran deeper than friendship. The town, of course, had noticed their growing connection. Martha Crawford mentioned it one day when she stopped by the schoolhouse with fresh eggs. "Tobias seems taken with you," Martha said, setting the basket on Zelda's table. "I've never seen my nephew spend so much time in town. Usually he can't wait to get back to the mountains." Zelda felt her face heat. "He's been kind enough to help me with my teaching." "Hum." Martha's eyes twinkled. "I'm not blind, dear. Neither is the rest of the town. Folks are wondering if we'll have a wedding before winter." "We're just friends," Zelda protested, even as her heart ached with the wish for more. "Friends don't look at each other the way you two do," Martha said. "But take your time. Good things are worth waiting for." That Saturday, Tobias took Zelda riding again, this time to a different spot, a waterfall that cascaded down black rock into a crystal pool. They tied the horses and sat on sun-warmed boulders, watching the water sparkle in the afternoon light. "I have a confession," Tobias said suddenly. Zelda's stomach tightened. "What is it?" "I've been coming to town more than I need to. The furs could wait, the supplies could stretch further. I've been making excuses to be here." He turned to face her fully. "Because of you," her breath caught. "Tobias, let me finish." He ran a hand through his long hair, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. "I'm not good with words, not like you are. But these past months, getting to know you, seeing your determination, your kindness with those children, your hunger to learn and grow, it's woken something in me I thought I'd buried. I'm falling in love with you, Zelda. Hell, I've already fallen." Zelda felt tears streaming down her face, but this time they were tears of pure joy. "I love you too. I have for weeks now, but I was afraid you only saw me as a student, someone to help." "Lord, no." Tobias reached out tentatively and cupped her face in one large, calloused hand. "May I kiss you?" "Please," she whispered. His lips met hers, gentle at first, almost reverent, then deepening as she responded. He pulled her close against his broad chest, and she felt small and safe and cherished in his arms. When they finally broke apart, both were breathless. "I don't have much to offer," Tobias said. "A cabin in the mountains, a life that's simple and often hard, but it's honest work, and I'd spend every day trying to make you happy." "I don't need much," Zelda said. "Just you." They sat by the waterfall until the sun began to sink toward the peaks, talking about a future together, about what their life might look like. Tobias explained that his cabin was remote, a 2-day ride from Sierra Vista, but that there was a smaller town, Prospect, just 4 hours away where she might be able to teach if she wanted to continue. Or you could do something else entirely, he said. I've been thinking about what Martha said about you having a gift for bringing stories to life. Have you ever considered writing them down, your own stories? Zelda blinked. I've never thought about it. I'm not sure I'd know how. You know stories better than anyone I've met. The way you talk about the books you read, you see the bones underneath, what makes them work. I think you could write something beautiful if you tried. The idea took root in her mind, thrilling and terrifying. Maybe, she said. But right now I have a commitment to the town to finish the school year at least. The children are counting on me. Of course, Tobias agreed. I wouldn't expect you to abandon them. The school year ends in May, doesn't it? That gives us time to plan properly. August melted into September, and the aspen trees began turning gold. Zelda's teaching had improved dramatically. She now handled arithmetic with confidence, had developed engaging history lessons by incorporating stories and personal accounts that made the past come alive, and had even started a weekly writing exercise where the children composed their own short stories. Several showed remarkable talent and creativity. Her relationship with Tobias deepened. Though they maintained propriety, the whole town knew they were courting. On Sundays after church, they would ride out together, exploring new trails, talking for hours about everything and nothing. He told her about his childhood in England, the poverty that drove his family to seek opportunity in America, the fever that had taken his parents within weeks of reaching New York. He'd been 14, suddenly alone in a strange country, and had survived through a combination of stubbornness, luck, and the kindness of strangers. She told him things she'd never shared with anyone, her deepest fears and hopes. How sometimes she still felt like a fraud even as her teaching improved, how she worried she'd never be enough, smart enough, good enough. "You're more than enough," Tobias said fiercely one evening as they watched the sun set over the mountains. "You're extraordinary, and I'll spend the rest of my life proving it to you if you'll let me." In October, he asked her formally to marry him, going down on one knee in the meadow where they'd first talked about falling in love. The ring was simple, a silver band he'd had the blacksmith make, but to Zelda it was more precious than any jeweled crown. "Yes," she said, pulling him up to kiss him. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." They planned the wedding for December, after the fall term ended, but before the worst of the winter weather set in. Martha was thrilled, immediately taking charge of preparations with the efficiency of a general marshalling troops. The whole town seemed excited, ready to celebrate the union with a party and dance at the church hall. But as the weeks passed, Zelda found herself grappling with a growing realization. She loved Tobias with all her heart, wanted to be his wife more than anything. But the idea of leaving teaching behind entirely felt wrong somehow, like abandoning a calling she'd only just discovered she had. One November evening, she voiced these feelings to Tobias as they sat in her small quarters behind the schoolhouse, properly leaving the door open so as not to scandalize the town. "I don't want you to give up something that matters to you," Tobias said immediately. "That's not the kind of marriage I want, where one person has to diminish themselves. But there's no school near your cabin, and I won't ask you to give up the life you love in the mountains just to stay near Sierra Vista." Tobias was quiet, thinking, what if we found a middle way? "I could trap the high country in winter when the pelts are best, but we could live in Prospect, the town I mentioned. It's bigger than Sierra Vista, probably needs a teacher." In the warmer months, we could spend more time at the cabin. I could guide hunting parties that pays well and doesn't require living in the mountains year-round. Hope bloomed in Zelda's chest. You do that. Change your whole life. I'm not changing my whole life, just adapting it to include you properly. He reached out and took her hand. Besides, I realized something. I went to the mountains originally to escape, to be alone because being around people reminded me of everything I'd lost. But you've shown me that connection, that being part of something larger that can be healing too. I don't need to hide anymore. Tears slipped down Zelda's cheeks. I don't deserve you. That works out well, since I don't deserve you either. We can be two undeserving people building a life together. In late November, Tobias rode to Prospect to investigate the teaching situation. He returned 3 days later with good news. The town did indeed need a teacher, the previous one having recently retired due to age. The position wouldn't be available until the next school year, but the town council was eager to have someone lined up and agreed to hire Zelda pending a meeting after the new year. There's more, Tobias said, pulling a folded paper from his pocket. I stopped at the newspaper office on a whim, asked if they ever publish stories. The editor said they run one piece of fiction every week, usually reprints from Eastern papers, but he's always looking for original work. I told him about you, about your gift for storytelling. He said he'd be happy to read anything you wanted to submit. Zelda stared at the paper, which contained the editor's name and address. Tobias, I've never written a complete story in my life. So write one now. You've got evenings and there's a few weeks before the wedding. Try at least. What's the worst that could happen? That night, after Tobias left, Zelda sat at her small table with a blank sheet of paper and a pencil. She thought about the stories she loved, the ones that had sustained her through dark times. She thought about her journey west, about finding herself in this wild, beautiful place, about discovering courage she hadn't known she possessed. She began to write. The story came slowly at first, then faster as she found the rhythm of it. It was about a young woman who took a position she wasn't qualified for and discovered her true calling through the help of an unexpected friend. It wasn't precisely her story. She changed details and added fictional elements, but the heart of it was true. She worked on it for a week, writing late into the night, revising during planning periods when the children were working independently. When it was finished, she read it over and felt a strange mix of pride and terror. It was rough, certainly, probably not good enough for publication, but it was hers. She'd created something from nothing but imagination and words. Tobias read it the next Saturday and looked up at her with shining eyes. Zelda, this is beautiful. You have to send it to the editor. It's not good enough. It's more than good enough. It's real and honest, and it made me feel things. That's what good stories do. He carefully folded the pages. Please, trust yourself the way I trust you. So she sent it off, and tried not to think about it as the wedding preparations intensified. The ceremony took place on a crisp December afternoon with the whole town in attendance. Zelda wore a simple dress of deep blue that Martha had helped her make, and Tobias wore clean buckskin pants with a white shirt that made his gray eyes look silver. They exchanged vows in the small church, promising to love and honor each other all their days, and when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Tobias kissed her with such tenderness that several women in the congregation wiped away tears. The party afterward was lively and warm, with music and dancing and more food than Zelda had seen in one place in years. She danced with Tobias, who turned out to be surprisingly graceful for such a large man, and with various townsmen who wanted to congratulate the bride. Martha pulled her aside at one point, hugging her tightly. "I'm so happy for you both," Martha said, "and grateful. You've been good for Tobias, brought him back to life. Before you came, he was just existing, not really living. He saved me, Zelda said. In every way a person can be saved. That night, they stayed in Tobias's house in town, the one where he'd first given her the mathematics books. Tomorrow they would ride to Prospect to meet with the school board there, then spend a week at his mountain cabin before returning to Sierra Vista, so Zelda could finish the school year. Lying in Tobias's arms as his wife, feeling safe and loved and home, Zelda thought about the desperate girl who'd stepped off the stagecoach 7 months ago. That girl had been running from her old life, terrified and full of deception. The woman she'd become was running toward something instead, toward purpose and love and a future bright with possibility. "What are you thinking?" Tobias murmured, running his fingers through her unbound hair. "That I'm happy. Truly happy, maybe for the first time in my life." He kissed her forehead. "Good. That's my plan for the rest of our lives, keeping you happy." "It's not all your responsibility," Zelda said. "We'll keep each other happy. Even better." They traveled to Prospect the next day, Zelda now comfortable enough on horseback to enjoy the journey. The town was indeed larger than Sierra Vista, with actual streets and sidewalks, several stores, a hotel, and a substantial church. The schoolhouse was bigger too, a 2-story building with separate rooms for different age groups. The meeting with the school board went well. Zelda was honest about her unconventional path to teaching, but emphasized her love of learning and her proven success in Sierra Vista. The board members seemed impressed by her passion and agreed to hire her starting the next school year, with the understanding that she could bring her husband to the meeting as well to discuss his potential work as a guide. "This could really work," Zelda said as they rode away from Prospect toward the mountains. "I could teach, you could guide, we could build a real life here." "We're going to build a real life wherever we are," Tobias said. "But yes, I think Prospect is a good fit." The ride to Tobias's cabin took 2 days, climbing steadily into higher elevations where snow already covered the ground and pine trees stood like dark sentinels. Zelda had worried she might find the isolation frightening, but instead she felt a deep peace settle over her as they moved away from civilization. The cabin was larger than she'd expected, solidly built with a stone fireplace and real glass windows. Inside was cozy, with a large bed covered in furs, a table and chairs Tobias had made himself, shelves full of books and supplies neatly organized. He'd clearly prepared for her arrival, cleaning and stocking the place with food. "It's wonderful," Zelda said, turning in a slow circle to take it all in. "I can see why you love it here." They spent a blissful week in the cabin, insulated from the world by snow and distance. Tobias taught Zelda how to snowshoe, and they explored the winter landscape together. He showed her how to identify animal tracks, how to move quietly through the forest, how to find beauty in the stark white wilderness. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, and Tobias would read aloud from his books while Zelda worked on mending or just listened to his deep voice rolling through the quiet. Sometimes they would talk late into the night about their dreams for the future, about the children they hoped to have someday, about growing old together in this wild country they both loved. When they returned to Sierra Vista in early January, Zelda threw herself back into teaching with renewed energy. The children had missed her, and she discovered she'd missed them too. The connection she felt with these young minds, the satisfaction of watching understanding dawn on a child's face when a difficult concept finally clicked, it fed something deep in her soul. In late January, a letter arrived from the Prospect newspaper. Zelda's hands shook as she opened it, certain it would be a polite rejection. Instead, The editor wrote that he found her story refreshingly authentic and emotionally resonant, and wanted to publish it in the next month's edition. Furthermore, he asked if she had more stories she could submit regularly. Zelda sat down hard on the nearest chair, the letter fluttering from her fingers. Tobias, who'd been splitting wood outside, came in at her cry. "What is it? What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong." She looked up at him with wonder. "They want to publish my story, and they want more. Tobias, they want more." He let out a whoop of joy and picked her up, spinning her around the small room. "I knew it. I knew you had something special." That evening, they celebrated with Martha and several other townspeople at the general store. The excitement was infectious. The idea that one of their own might become a published author filled the little town with pride. "You've found your calling," Martha said, squeezing Zelda's hand. "Not just teaching, but writing too. You're going to touch so many lives with your words." Over the following months, Zelda wrote whenever she could find spare time. She discovered that teaching actually fed her writing, the children's questions and observations sparking ideas for stories. She wrote about the West, about ordinary people finding courage in extraordinary circumstances, about love and loss and hope and redemption. The Prospect newspaper published her second story in March, then her third in April. The editor wrote that readers were responding enthusiastically, asking for more work by Zelda Johnson. Some papers in other towns had even inquired about reprinting her stories. "You're becoming famous," Tobias teased one evening as they walked through Sierra Vista in the spring twilight. "Hardly famous, but people are reading my words, connecting with my stories. It feels like magic." The school year ended in May, and Zelda bid a tearful farewell to her students at Sierra Vista. Several of the older children had progressed remarkably, and she felt confident she'd given them a solid foundation. The town threw a party to thank her for her service and wish her well in Prospect. "You came here as a stranger," Martha said in her speech to the gathered crowd. "But you became one of us. You gave our children not just education but inspiration. You showed them that with determination and heart, you can become anything you want to be." Zelda could barely speak through her tears as she thanked the town for taking a chance on her, for giving her the opportunity that had changed her life. In June, she and Tobias moved to Prospect, settling into a small house on the edge of town that Tobias had arranged to rent with an option to buy. It had 2 bedrooms, a real parlor, and even a small study where Zelda could write. She prepared for the new school year with the confidence of experience now, developing a curriculum that balanced academic rigor with creative engagement. She incorporated writing exercises she developed in Sierra Vista, and planned to share some of her published stories with the older students to inspire their own creativity. Tobias found work easily as a guide, his knowledge of the mountains and his skills as a tracker making him valuable to hunters and prospectors. He enjoyed the work more than he'd expected, discovering he had a gift for teaching wilderness skills to greenhorns from the east. "I learned it from you," he told Zelda one evening. "Watching you teach, the patience you have, the way you break complicated things down into manageable pieces. You're a natural teacher and you made me one too." In August, Zelda realized she was pregnant. The discovery filled her with a joy so profound she could barely contain it. When she told Tobias, he gathered her into his arms and held her for a long moment, his face buried in her hair. "A baby," he whispered. "We're going to have a baby. Are you happy?" She asked, though she could feel the answer in the way he was holding her. "Happier than I knew it was possible to be." The pregnancy progressed smoothly. Zelda continued teaching through the fall, her expanding belly a source of fascination for her younger students. She continued writing too, finding that the creative work helped settle her mind when worry about the coming birth threatened to overwhelm her. In December, the Prospect editor offered her a regular column, a monthly story for which he would pay $5. It was more money than she'd expected, and combined with her teaching salary and Tobias's guide work, they were comfortable enough to start talking seriously about buying their house. The baby came in March of 1877, a boy with his father's gray eyes and a fierce cry that announced his presence to the world. They named him Samuel, after Tobias's father, and from the moment Tobias held his son for the first time, Zelda knew she'd never seen a man more utterly transformed by love. "He's perfect," Tobias said, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "You're both perfect." Zelda took the rest of the school year off to care for Samuel, and the school board readily agreed, holding her position for the next fall. She continued writing, often with the baby sleeping in a basket beside her desk, and found that motherhood gave her new depths to explore in her stories, new understanding of the fierce protective love that could drive a person to any lengths. In the summer, they took Samuel to the mountain cabin for the first time. Watching Tobias introduce their son to the wilderness he loved, explaining the names of trees and birds in a soft voice, Zelda felt her heart might burst from the fullness of it all. They spent a month there, and Zelda wrote some of her best work in that peaceful setting, stories that dug deeper into the human heart than anything she'd done before. The editor published them with increasing enthusiasm, and by fall, her stories were being reprinted in newspapers across Colorado Territory and beyond. Life settled into a rich rhythm. Zelda taught during the school year, wrote whenever she could find time, and poured love into raising Samuel. Tobias worked as a guide, took on some fur trapping in winter, and was a devoted husband and father. In the summers, they would retreat to the mountain cabin for weeks at a time, living simply and freely. In 1879, Zelda gave birth to a daughter they named Margaret after her mother. The little girl had Zelda's dark curls and a smile that could light up the darkest room. Samuel, now 2, was fascinated by his baby sister, wanting to help with everything from diaper changes to feedings. The family grew together, rooted in love and the wild country around them. Zelda's writing career flourished. By 1880, she'd had stories published in Harper's Weekly and other prestigious Eastern publications. An editor from Boston wrote asking if she'd ever considered writing a novel. The idea terrified and thrilled her in equal measure, but with Tobias's encouragement, she began working on a longer manuscript, a story about a woman's journey west and the man who helped her discover her true self. It was thinly veiled autobiography, and writing it meant revisiting the frightened girl who'd stepped off the stagecoach in Sierra Vista 5 years earlier. Sometimes the emotions overwhelmed her, and she'd have to stop, but Tobias was always there, steady and encouraging, believing in her even when she doubted herself. "You've come so far," he'd tell her, "from pretending to be a teacher to becoming one of the best in the territory. From being afraid to write to having your words read across the country. You can do this too." The novel took 2 years to complete. She sent it to the Boston editor in 1882, then waited in an agony of suspense for months. When the letter finally came offering to publish it, she screamed so loud she woke both children from their naps. The book was published in 1883 under the title The Teacher's Journey by Zelda Brennan. It sold modestly, but received warm reviews, with critics praising its honest portrayal of frontier life and the emotional depth of the characters. For Zelda, the real reward was the letters she began receiving from readers, especially women, who said her story had given them courage to pursue their own dreams. Through it all, her relationship with Tobias only deepened. He remained her rock, her shelter, her greatest champion. He'd aged well, his hair showing threads of silver now, his face weathered by sun and wind, but he was still the powerful, gentle man she'd fallen in love with. He still made her heart race when he walked into a room, still knew how to make her laugh when she was taking herself too seriously, still held her at night like she was the most precious thing in his world. In 1885, when Zelda was 32 and Tobias was 35, they had their third child, another boy they named Thomas. By then, Samuel was 8 and Margaret was 6, both bright children who loved books and the outdoors in equal measure. The family split their time between Prospect and the mountain cabin, which Tobias had expanded over the years to accommodate their growing family. In town, Zelda taught and wrote and was active in community affairs, helping to establish a library and advocating for better educational resources. In the mountains, they lived simply, the children learning to track and fish and identify plants alongside their father, while Zelda wrote and drew inspiration from the timeless landscape. One summer evening in 1888, after the children were asleep, Zelda and Tobias sat outside the cabin watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. They'd been married 13 years, and Zelda loved him more than she had on their wedding day, something she wouldn't have believed possible back then. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "Giving up your solitary life in the mountains to be tied down with a wife and children?" Tobias pulled her closer against his side. "I didn't give anything up. I traded one life for a better one. The mountains are still here, still beautiful, but experiencing them with you and the children, teaching Samuel and Margaret and Thomas to love them the way I do, that's richer than anything I had before." "I was so lost when I came here," Zelda said softly. "I thought I was just running away from poverty and a dead-end life. But I was really running toward you, toward this life we've built together." "We saved each other," Tobias said. "You think I rescued you, but you brought me back to the world. You taught me that strength isn't about standing alone. It's about having the courage to let people in." Zelda turned to kiss him, this man who'd seen her when she was barely more than a fraud desperately trying to become real, who'd believed in her potential before she believed in it herself, who'd encouraged her gifts until she found her true calling, not just as a teacher but as a writer, a mother, a woman who'd built a life beyond anything she dared dream. "I love you," she said, "more than all the words in all my stories could ever express." "That's all right," Tobias said, his gray eyes reflecting starlight. "You can spend the rest of our lives trying to find the right ones," and she did. Zelda continued writing for decades, producing novels and stories that captured the spirit of the West and the hearts of readers across the country. She taught generations of children in Prospect, inspiring many of them to pursue their own dreams. She and Tobias raised 3 remarkable children who went on to have families of their own, filling the mountain cabin with grandchildren who learned to love the wilderness and stories in equal measure. But the greatest story she ever told was the one she lived, the tale of a frightened young woman who'd taken a desperate chance and found not just a calling but a love that transformed everything. It was a story of courage rewarded, of talents nurtured and discovered, of 2 people from very different worlds building something beautiful together. Years later, when Zelda was old and her books lined the shelves of libraries throughout the West, young women would sometimes seek her out and ask how she'd done it, how she'd become a successful writer and teacher when the odds were so stacked against her. She would always smile and say the same thing: "I had help. I had someone who believed in me before I believed in myself, who encouraged my hidden talents until I found my calling. That made all the difference." Then she'd look at Tobias, still strong and protective even in his old age, still the mountain man with the gentle heart who'd changed her life. And she'd know that calling implied something solitary, something individual. But her truest calling had been shared, a life built together with a man who'd shown her that the greatest adventures weren't found in books or even in the wild country they both loved. The greatest adventure was love, real and deep and lasting, and she'd lived it every day. On their 50th wedding anniversary in 1925, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren in the mountain cabin that had expanded into a proper lodge, Tobias stood with some difficulty, his body finally showing the weight of his 75 years, and raised a glass. "To Zelda," he said, his voice still strong even if his body wasn't, "who came to Sierra Vista as a teacher and taught me the most important lesson of my life, that a heart can always find room for more love. 50 years ago, I made the best decision of my life when I offered to help a frightened young woman with her arithmetic. I thought I was just lending some books. I didn't know I was finding my soulmate." Zelda, 72 now and still sharp as ever, stood and took his hand. "And I thought I was just trying to survive, to fake my way through a job I wasn't qualified for. I didn't know I was walking into the greatest love story I'd ever tell." Their children and grandchildren applauded, and someone started playing the fiddle, and soon the whole cabin was filled with music and dancing and laughter. Zelda watched it all, this beautiful chaotic family they'd created, and marveled at how far she'd come from that dusty stagecoach arrival in 1875. She'd come looking for a job and found a calling, looking for escape and found a home, looking for survival and found love that had lasted 50 years and would last until her final breath. That night, lying in bed beside Tobias in their room in the cabin, listening to the same wind in the pines that she'd heard on her first visit here decades ago, Zelda thought about all the stories she'd written, all the lives she'd touched through her teaching and her words. But the best story, the truest story, was the one she'd lived. It was a story about a teacher who came to a small town desperate and dishonest, about a mountain man who saw past the deception to the potential beneath, about hidden talents nurtured until they bloomed, about finding your calling not alone but with someone who believed in you. It was a love story, pure and simple, the kind that lasted not because it was easy but because it was real, built on mutual respect and encouragement, on seeing and celebrating each other's gifts, on growing together rather than apart. "Still awake," Tobias murmured in the darkness. "Just thinking about how lucky I am," Zelda said. "We both are." He pulled her close and she settled against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. Lucky and grateful. As she drifted toward sleep, Zelda silently thanked that desperate, frightened girl who'd had the courage to take a chance 50 years ago. "Thank you for being brave enough to lie your way onto that stagecoach, for stepping into the unknown, for staying when it got hard. Thank you for being open to love when it appeared in the form of a mountain man with kind eyes and patient heart. Everything good in my life came from that one brave, desperate act." And she thanked Tobias, though he was already asleep, for seeing her, for believing in her, for encouraging her hidden talents until she found not just one calling but several, for loving her enough to change his life to accommodate hers, for being her partner in every sense of the word. The town had needed a teacher, and she'd needed a second chance. What they'd both found was so much more than either had hoped for. A love that had grown and deepened over 50 years, that had weathered hardships and celebrated joys, that had created a legacy of children and stories and students whose lives were richer for having known them. It was, Zelda thought as sleep finally claimed her, a pretty good story after all. maybe the best one she'd ever been part of. And unlike the stories she wrote, where she controlled every word and could revise until they were perfect, this one had been gloriously unpredictable, full of surprises and detours and moments she never could have planned. That was the beauty of real life, she supposed. You could start out heading one direction, lost and alone, and end up somewhere completely different, found and loved and home at last. All it took was a little courage, a lot of determination, and someone who believed in you enough to light the way forward. She'd had all three, and it had made all the difference. As the years went on, Zelda and Tobias lived out their remaining time surrounded by the love they'd cultivated. They passed within months of each other in 1928, Tobias first and then Zelda, as if she couldn't bear to be without him for long. They were buried side by side in a small cemetery in Prospect, with a headstone that read simply, Tobias and Zelda Brennan. He saw her. She found herself. Together they built a life of love. Their children placed copies of Zelda's books at the base of the stone, and someone planted wildflowers that bloomed every summer, purple lupines and yellow columbines, just like the ones from that first meadow where Tobias had shown her the real West, where she'd begun to believe she could be something more than a scared girl running from her past. The books she'd written remained in print for generations, her stories of the West and the people who'd built lives there continuing to inspire readers long after she was gone. But more than the published words, her legacy lived on in the students she'd taught, in her children and grandchildren who carried forward her love of learning and stories, in the example she'd set of courage and determination, and the transformative power of believing in yourself. And somewhere in the mountains above Prospect, in a meadow full of wildflowers where the wind whispered through the pines, her story lingered like a blessing, a reminder that sometimes the best things in life come from taking chances, from being brave enough to reach for more, from finding someone who sees your potential and loves you enough to help you become everything you were meant to be. The town had needed a teacher, but what it got was so much more. It got Zelda Johnson, who became Zelda Brennan, who became a teacher and a writer and a mother and a legend, all because a mountain man with a gentle heart had seen something special in a frightened young woman, and had encouraged her hidden talents until she found her calling. Multiple callings, as it turned out. Teacher, writer, mother, wife, friend, inspiration, but the calling that mattered most, the one that made all the others possible, was simply this: beloved. She was beloved by Tobias, by her children, by her students, by her readers, by the town that had taken a chance on an unqualified teacher, and gained so much more than they'd bargained for. And in being beloved, she'd learned to believe in herself, to reach for dreams she hadn't known she had, to become more than she'd ever imagined possible. That was the real story, the one that mattered most. Not the books she published or the students she taught, though those mattered too. The real story was about transformation, about what happens when someone sees you truly and loves you anyway, when someone believes in you enough that you start believing in yourself, when someone stands beside you and says, "You can do this, and I'll help you." Tobias had been that person for Zelda, and in return, she'd been that person for him, drawing him out of isolation and back into the world of connection and community. They'd saved each other, built a life together that was richer and fuller than anything either could have created alone, and left behind a legacy of love that echoed through generations. In the end, that was the greatest story Zelda ever told, the one written not in words on paper but in the lives they touched, the family they created, the love they shared. It was a story of two people who found each other when they needed it most, who saw the best in each other and helped bring it forth, who built something lasting in a wild country that demanded strength and courage and hope. It was a Western love story, true to the bone, full of beauty and hardship and triumph. It was real and honest and imperfect and absolutely beautiful. And it ended exactly as it should have, with two people who loved each other deeply, who'd lived full, rich lives together, who'd found their callings and followed them, who'd raised a family and built a community and made the world a little bit better for having been in it. The town had needed a teacher, and the teacher had needed a second chance, and the mountain man had needed someone to bring him back to life. What they all got was love, redemption, purpose, and a story worth telling for generations to come. It was a happy ending, earned through courage and work and faith, the kind that satisfies deep in the soul because it feels true and right and complete. And that, as Zelda would have written if she were telling this story herself, is exactly what a good story should do.